The Legend of Zelda, Twilight Princess, is fundamentally a game about power. The idea of power is constantly invoked throughout the game in relation to weapons and magical items, of course, but also for the conflicting magic of light, twilight, and darkness, and even the will and right of the gods themselves. This obsession with and examination of power is not only confined to the game's script and dialogue, but is something which directly influences almost every idea the game presents. Viewing the game and the story it's trying to tell through the lens of it as a collection of ideas about power presents a very different narrative from how many might view the game upon first playing it, which, even if you don't agree with this assessment of the game, it is just one possible interpretation of many after all, can provide an alternate perspective. And while not everything in the game fits neatly into this framing device, I think that you might be surprised at how many things do. So, if you'll come with me, let's tell a story about strength, power, and influence, and hopefully, by the end, decide, what are the politics of Twilight Princess? An idea which is invoked frequently throughout the game is that Link is the chosen hero of the gods. It's said often enough that it's easy to skim over it and not consider what exactly this means within the context of the game. At different points, we hear various things that relate to the will of the gods, and how they enact that will. The gods are presented as, in a historical context, intervening in events of the mortal world, for the most part either to bestow power on those they consider worthy, such as giving a powerful magical artifact, the Fused Shadow, to the Gorons for protection, or to take it away from those who are unworthy, or those who have become too strong, such as their removal of power from and subsequent banishment of the Twilight. The one common thread in these cases, however, is that what is bestowed upon or taken away from any group or individual is an item or ability representative of literal force and power. These artifacts are able to be used to cause physical destruction or damage. For Link, however, it is far less clear what exactly his chosen status means. Presented clearly in the game, there are two primary potential manifestations of chosenness. The first being Link's ability to transform into a beast, specifically a wolf, instead of a spirit while in the Twilight Realm, and the second being his ability to wield the Blade of Evil's Bane, the Master Sword. Tackling the transformation into wolf form first, is this what it means that he is chosen? Well, the short answer is no. As the light spirit Ordona says, in the land covered in twilight, where people roam as spirits, you were transformed into a blue-eyed beast. That was a sign. It was a sign that the powers of the Chosen One rest within you. So, as Ordona said, his transformation was just a sign, indicative of the actual power. But this quote also raises an interesting point: power. It confirms that there is some power associated with Link's chosen status, though, frustratingly for us, Ordona never indicates what that power might be. Another spirit, this one in the Cave of Ordeals in the Gerudo Desert, says, "Your power is a gift given only to those with the confidence to wield it." Once again, this implies that there is an actual power which he possesses, but, once again, does not tell us what. This brings us to the second possibility, use of the Master Sword. Now, as those who are familiar with the Zelda series may know, in other entries of the series, the sword has, to some degree, an ability to determine if the wielder is worthy of it, in most cases a hero. However, while this is true, it seems again to be only an indicator of someone who has been chosen, not an aspect of it. At no point within the game's narrative does any explicitly divine character direct Link to the sword. In fact, as Zelda says of the blade, the Master Sword was crafted by the wisdom of the ancient sages. The fact that the origin of the sword lies in relatively non-divine entities, or at least not divine to the degree of the gods, would seem to imply that it is just an implement for Link to carry out his duty, not something he is chosen for in itself. Wait a second, so if neither of those are what it means that Link is chosen, what does it mean? Well, I would argue that Link being chosen is more representative of his knowledge and power he receives from possession of that knowledge than it is of some direct intervention and presenting of physical power by the gods. Throughout the game, though we see Link perform various feats, all of them are effectively within the realm of normal human possibility when considering use of magic items and somewhat prodigious ability. And while the implication within the game is that these abilities to some degree stem from his divine backing, the thing which truly leads him to perform the feats he does is, well, his knowledge of what is occurring. Essentially, the only direct connection we see between Link and semi-divine beings consists almost entirely not of a presentation of magical artifacts or new abilities, but of knowledge of the nature of the evils afflicting Hyrule. Later in the game, we even see that it is possible for them to give items of physical power when they provide Zelda with the Bow of Light. However, when meeting with the Light Spirits, the only thing they provide to Link, even after having been fully restored to power, is information on the nature of the Twilight, the circumstances of their loss of power, and the locations of Link's objectives. While, once again, many of the feats Link performs are certainly requiring of magical artifacts and great courage, none of them are something which the game presents as explicitly outside of the realm of possibility for other individuals, and other individuals are even seen performing actions that might usually be associated with Link, namely the Resistance. Link's being given the means to recognize evil provides him with the ability to address it. But the game even goes somewhat further than this, to the point of suggesting not only is a full understanding of evil necessary to remedy it, but also that possession of this knowledge in itself necessitates a response, that those with understanding have a prerogative to act. After looking on the citizens of Hyrule, who, under the occupation of Twilight, have become spirits without full knowledge of their circumstance or power to act, Midna says to Link, "What a shame. I mean, maybe you'd rather just wander as a spirit like the rest of them, totally unaware of what was happening for all eternity, right?" Here, as Midna poses this question to Link, she draws a direct link, so to speak, between knowledge of what is occurring and the ability and even necessity to act on that knowledge. The phrasing of the question isn't really even a question, more Midna musing to herself over what Link might prefer, not over something that existed as an actual option to him. Link's spirit's manifestation into the form of a wolf in the Twilight Realm is representative of the fact that complacency and a circumstance such as Midna described are impossible. Link becomes incompatible with society until he has freed that part of society of direct evil influence. Not only is the game's implication that knowledge of evil and injustice and acceptance of that knowledge necessary to defeat it, possession of that knowledge in itself creates that necessity. As Midna laments, how sad to be right in front of someone and not noticed at all. And no one knows what you have done. You may be doomed to toil in obscurity forever. But the game's response is that, well, that's the way it is. Upon our first meeting of her, Zelda says of the citizens of Hyrule, or at least Hyrule proper, better known as everything within the walls of Hyrule Castle Town, remember this detail, we'll get back to it, within the twilight they live on, unaware that they have passed into spirit forms. All the people know now is fear, fear of a nameless evil. As the light spirit Farron further elaborates, in this twilight, those who live in the light become mere spirits. Between these two explanations, we can gather about as much as we discussed earlier, being that the spirits are both, 1, unaware of the exact circumstances they are under, and 2, unaware to act against them. But wait up, let's jump back to what we mentioned about Zelda's explanation, the one that gives us the most info. Zelda seems pretty confident in her explanation of the effects of Twilight as being largely a sense of discomfort, and for the people in Hyrule Center, she's basically right. Later, while there is some issue caused by the lack of running water in Castle Town, this is presented more as an inconvenience and an interruption of the life of privilege led by the residents of Castle Town than it is a legitimate threat to them. As one unnamed man says, if this water outage continues, we soon won't be able to relax with a cup of tea. Even in Hyrule's greatest time of crisis, loss of comfort such as tea are some of the primary evils experienced here. However, if we look to those outside of the bounds of the Hyrule Castle Town walls, the experiences of these people tell a very different story. In Kakariko Village, the ever-dwindling population cowers in fear within their houses, hiding from a threat much more real than Zelda's nameless evil. As Barnes, owner of the town bond shop, says, "Remember that lady from the general store? Just one of those things attacked her, and a whole gang from town went to save her. And what happened? She was already gone, and there were 2 monsters waiting. You connect in the dots? That means that if we get attacked by them, then we'll be..." This quote clearly illustrates that these people are under direct, fatal threat from Twilight occupation of Hyrule, and unlike in Hyrule Castle Town, their problems aren't solved when the Twilight is removed. The immediate threat may be gone, but the scars of its presence remain, through the ruin of Barnes' business, the continued hostility of the Gorons, and the loss of community members. To the north, in the domain of the Zora people, the situation is even more dire. Not only have their means of transportation, the rivers that snake across northern Hyrule, dried up, in their home, Zora Village, the majority of their population has been frozen in ice. The fact remains here, too, that even after the Twilight is eliminated, they have lost their leader to execution by the forces of Twilight. Almost no matter where you look, it is clear that the effects of Twilight are not equally felt by all parts and peoples of Hyrule. While in the insulated and guarded castle town, it is nothing more than a sense of discomfort and a series of minor annoyances, occupation and its effects are very immediate and real in places such as the Zora and Kakariko villages. When drought strikes, the people of Castle Town are more concerned with their baths than they are with the people who live where the droughts have occurred. This fits fairly well into a framing of a story which is, at least in this part of the game, a narrative about systems of inequality and power, and the unequal intensities of systems of oppression. The Hylians of Castletown are presented as a privileged upper class in the kingdom, distant in circumstance from those who are on the outside to such a degree that even violent regime change fails to shake this position. And while the system of oppression, here manifested in the Twilight occupation, does affect all citizens of Hyrule, its effects are significantly magnified and prolonged for the kingdoms already underprivileged. The game presents the people of Castletown as elitist and knowingly wasteful of their resources, frequenting shops with overpriced items that in some cases drain your money further, and returning to their usual consumption of water immediately after the unexplained drought, almost as if to make as clear as possible that the effects of the oppressive systems present in Hyrule for much of the first half of the game are in no way equally distributed in favor of the privileged, much as is the case with such systems in the real world. Power, even powers framed as morally incompatible, such as the powers of light and darkness, are ultimately shown to be not quite so incompatible when it comes to the continuation of the status quo. The extent of Twilight Princess's thoughts on systems of oppression don't end at their condemnation of the unequal effects and the complacency created by this in the upper class of any given society, be that upper class social, political, economic, or in most cases some combination of the three. In fact, the game goes on to arguably explain exactly how it thinks that these circumstances must be dealt with, even if it fails to address something we'll touch on a bit later. Though this theme is represented in various areas throughout the narrative, it is most evident and directly communicated in Midna's character arc and her relationship with the World of Light through Link's character. While Link has his own character, even more so than in most other Zelda titles, especially in relation to the people of Ordon Village and the Resistance, to certain characters, namely Midna, he represents less of a character of his own, rather, I would argue, almost a human embodiment of the World of Light itself. Within the game, the World of Light is presented as something more than simply a plane of existence. It is personified, and its well-being is directly linked to the well-being of its personifications. The light spirits, which inhabit each region of the kingdom, are made literally weak in order to allow the faltering of the light world into Twilight. While Link is not linked to the world in this physical sense, he is in the sense that his relationship with Midna both informs and mirrors her relationship with the light world as a whole. As she tells Link upon their entry into the Gerudo Desert, "That's why, when I found you, I thought I could use you, Link. I only cared about returning our world to normal. I didn't care about what happened to the World of Light, not at all. But after witnessing the selfless lengths that Princess Zelda and you have gone to, the sacrifices, I know now, in the bottom of my heart, that I must save this world too. There is no other way. Midna's entire character arc revolves around her gradual recognition that the only way to truly address the problems afflicting Hyrule, and as we'll later see, her world, is to uniformly address both. While Midna begins the game seeking to rid Hyrule of Twilight only so that she might find the artifacts necessary to save her world and restore her power, she ultimately discovers, somewhat retrospectively, that, while not necessarily wrong, she missed the larger point. While she saw the saving of Hyrule as a step on the way to the saving of her world, they were in fact inextricably linked, with the two being necessary to each other. The game even goes so far as to suggest the idea that incomplete justice is inherently unable to sustain itself, with Midna saying, "So, even if you go back now with all of the people you saved, the whole tragedy would just repeat itself." Not only would this partial solution for a single group be failing to address the overarching issue, it would not be able to survive without addressing it. This concept of the necessity of addressing all forms of evil in order to truly eliminate any of them is prevalent throughout the game, and while Midna's arc is the most constant example of it, it is present elsewhere. At various points within the game's narrative, Link facilitates the cooperation of various groups within Hyrule, largely between the Gorons, Zora, and Hylians. When he first arrives in Kakariko Village early in the game, the relationship between the Hylians and Gorons is strained at best, despite the openness of both the citizens of Kakariko and many Gorons to cooperation. Through Link's restoration of the Goron patriarch Darbus to his former self after he was corrupted by the fused shadow, however, relations are restored. Later, Link aids in the return of the Gorons to Hyrule proper, and the cooperation of the Zoras and Hylians to save a Zora prince from sickness. Interestingly though, the helping and cooperation of the groups in Hyrule isn't presented as something necessary to the defeating of a greater power, rather something facilitating collective strength against general hardship, in providing resources, knowledge, or other forms of mutual aid. This cooperation is never shown to be any kind of strength against a force such as Zant, Ganondorf, or even the Twilight itself. While Midna's arc posits that a uniform response is necessary to defeat evil, these narratives of cooperation present the idea that even a basically functional society is contingent upon this philosophy. While many stories, even many Zelda stories, place focus on ideas of cooperation, Twilight Princess's proposal of the necessity of an almost intersectional lens for viewing injustice and evil, and correspondingly complete approach to eradicating them, is somewhat more unique, and true to the game's apparent commitment not just to the condemnation of ideas, but also to the presentation of their potential solutions or alternatives. These ideas are an interesting counterpoint to one of the game's most interesting. At the beginning of this video, I said that Twilight Princess was, fundamentally, a game about power. And while we've talked about that in the senses of power of knowledge, of oppressive systems, and of collectivism, we haven't really broadly talked about the game's thoughts on power itself. Arguably, Twilight Princess's most meaningful messages about power come in its presentation of Zelda, the institution of the Kingdom of Hyrule, and the gods. The most important thing to know, beginning our discussion of this, is that, as the game presents it, the Kingdom of Hyrule is a failed institution, both functionally and philosophically. It is shown in almost every aspect and on every level of its presence to be dysfunctional, with massive inequality in the Outer Kingdom, a wasteful and privileged populace in its centers of power, and a weak and ineffectual state. Troops patrol the safe streets of the castle town at the same time that enemy soldiers stand on the bridge into the city and terrorize the kingdom's outer provinces. Despite the vast power accumulated in the kingdom, in the wealth of the people, the equipment of the armies, and the strength of their ruler in even a divine sense, they are weak, unable to act, forced to surrender immediately to Zant's invading armies. However, the presentation of this failure is not exclusively meant to reflect on the failure of this state, or even states in general, but the philosophy and concept of great power in the right places being an effective deterrent to power in the wrong places and misuse of that power. First of all, considering Princess Zelda, the head of state in Hyrule, it might be easy to initially suggest that she, in the same way that Link personifies the Light World, is a personification for the Kingdom of Hyrule. In the same way as Link, she possesses a sense of divine chosenness, and at least a metaphorical connection to the well-being of the kingdom. We first meet her as Hyrule is under occupation of the forces of Twilight, locked away in a tower of Hyrule Castle, wearing a black cloak bearing symbolism reminiscent of that of the people of Twilight. The connections are not difficult to make. As Midna says, "It still appalls me that this world of light is controlled by that princess. A carefree youth, a life of luxury. How does that teach duty? But I guess I shouldn't begrudge her the circumstances of her life. She didn't choose it, after all." This characterization of Zelda is also clearly meant to be correlative to Hyrule proper as a whole. While at different points, Hyrule is implied to include the various areas outside of the very center in Castle Town, it is glaringly obvious that, even if these outer provinces may pay tribute to the crown, what matters to those in power is that center. And that center fits that description of Zelda very well: lives of privilege, ignorance towards the outside, and even if they were aware, a lack of any sense of duty to help others. However, I would argue that, while all of this is true and interesting, the most important thoughts about power concerning Zelda stem from her place as being, in a specific sense, antithetical to Hyrule. Zelda, despite her flaws, is ultimately, as much as any other character we see in the game, a virtuous person who is, as much as any monarch can be, a good ruler. However, this good ruler is put in charge of a system and set of institutions we have been shown to be fundamentally broken and ineffective. Despite a virtuous person leading Hyrule, their military was ineffective, their inequality remained, and they ultimately put up no actual defense against Zant's invasion. Good people in the right places, even the most powerful position in the kingdom, weren't enough to manipulate or change these systems. Sure, maybe inequality wasn't something Zelda would have wanted to fix, but the military, something one would think would be an easier to reform institution from her position, experiences virtually no change. The idea that having the right people in positions of great power, be that head of state, a corporation, or even simply wealth, is enough to make those institutions good is quite popular with a lot of people, but Twilight Princess suggests that in fact, good people in bad institutions cannot even manipulate those institutions to be good. But this idea is not just communicated through the existence and ultimate fate of the Kingdom of Hyrule, but also through the entire philosophy of the gods that created it. In almost every possible instance within the game, the gods make the choice to counter great power in undesirable places, either by placing balancing power into the hands of those who are good, or taking the power from those who would misuse it and instead entrusting it to those who they trust to protect it. And in almost every possible instance, they are suggested to be wrong in this decision. In one of the most important and meaningful scenes in the game, we are told by the sages of Hyrule, in this time spirits, the story of the execution of the thief king Ganondorf. This story is one of dramatic irony which, in the simplest form we see it, explains the hypocrisy of the gods and their relationship to power. As a sage says, in all his fury and might, he, referring to Ganondorf, was blind to any danger, and thus he was exposed, subdued, and brought to justice. However, ultimately, their execution attempt failed, and Ganondorf freed himself, killing a sage in the process. To restrain him, in a desperate move, he was banished by the remaining sages to the Twilight Realm. Of this mistake, the sage continues, "It was our fault. We overestimated our abilities as sages and attempted to put an end to Ganondorf's evil magic." The sages attempted to defeat Ganondorf and his magic with magical strength of their own, which ultimately proved insufficient. While Ganondorf's use of power blinded him to the risk of defeat, the sages' belief that their possession of power would be enough also blinded them. The same conceit and over-reliance on power led both Ganondorf and the sages to overextend themselves. And while, as we referenced earlier, the fact that the sages were not of the same divine level of the gods, they are entities who claim, at very least, to be acting on their behalf. Once again, the concept that all that is necessary to combat power is greater power is challenged. But these ideas are not only limited to a divine context, but can also be found, like the threads of many other ideas, in Midna's story. Midna, for much of the course of the game, believes that she will prove her worthiness to the throne of Twilight by using the magic of the fused shadow to overpower Zant. She says of him, "His power is a false one. I'll prove it using these," referencing the fused shadows. She seeks to use the same justification that the most powerful has the right to rule for her power that Zant uses for his, perversely justifying his claim to the throne. Ultimately, however, Midna proves her worthiness not by her defeat of Zant, but after she destroys the Mirror of Twilight, choosing to lock both herself and her people away permanently. Though this may initially appear to also demonstrate power, I would argue that there is an important distinction to make. The game, at various points, draws a distinct line between power and strength, the contrast between power, wielding influence against others, and strength, wielding it for others. Interestingly, though, I would argue that within the context of the game, both are basically amoral uses of influence. Power is invoked both by good and evil characters, and is presented as being used in both positive and negative ways. And while strength is generally presented more positively, such as with Link, Ilya, and Colin, it's arguable that Midna's choice is also representative of this, which is a much more morally gray decision. Because of this amoral quality that strength and power appear to contextually possess, even if you disagree with Midna's decision, there exists a clear distinction between her initial belief of what would prove her and the thing which ultimately does. Once again, power in itself does not present the solution. Power within Twilight Princess, while being presented amorally, almost is always presented as the problem, not the solution to any given situation. Power itself, regardless of context, is presented as, if not inherently evil, inherently unable to be a solution to any given issue caused by power, and the morals or sentiments of whoever might wield it can't change that. Before the self-appointed King of Twilight, Zant, is killed, in a conversation with Midna, he delivers one of the game's most interesting lines, which simultaneously explains his motivations and presents why he's wrong. As Zant says, addressing Midna, "You speak of magic? Still your tongue for a moment, and I will tell you of both magic and the oppression of ages. The people of our tribe, a tribe that mastered the arts of magic, were locked away in this world like insects in a cage. In the shadows we regressed, so much that we soon knew neither anger nor hatred, nor even the faintest bloom of desire. And all of it was the fault of a useless, do-nothing royal family that had resigned itself to a miserable half-existence. I had served and endured in that depraved household for far too long, my impudent princess. And why, you ask? Because I believed I would be the next to rule our people. That is why. But would they acknowledge me as their king? No, and as such, I was denied the magic powers befitting of our ruler. It was then, in the thrall of hatred and despair, that I turned my eyes to the heavens, and found a god. My god had only one wish, to merge shadow and light, and make darkness." When Midna responds by suggesting that Zant was denied the kingship due to his clear greed and lust for power, he retorts, referencing Link and Midna's relationship with him, "My Midna, did you forget? That beast is one of the light dwellers who oppressed our people. No matter how much you may desire otherwise, you will never be more than a shadow in their world. You cannot consort with their kind. Not just for me, but for all of our people. Lend me your power." These quotes reveal to us several important things about Zant. First, Zant views himself as, to a degree, some sort of revolutionary, or at least a liberator. He identifies correctly, I'm sure a lot of people would agree, the injustice of the positions people have been put into. He sees the Twilight incursion into the light world as a necessary action to free them. But I think it's pretty clear that, if this was ever truly his goal, it became nothing more than a justification for his acquisition of power long ago. Instead of the invasion of the light world acting as a freeing of his people, Zant forcibly transformed them into an invasion force to acquire territory and power on his behalf, while at home in the Twilight establishing an even stricter consolidation of power than the one that had preceded it. Zant created an anti-revolutionary revolution, a regime espousing revolutionary ideals but which retained the same systems of power that maintained the status quo in the Twilight Realm before his ascension to the throne. Initially, it might appear that, since his quote-unquote success was in a way a counterpoint to the philosophy of the gods, he did not make the same mistake they did. After all, his use of power worked, and his invasion was successful. But Zant's story tries to say that even if a use of power might be successful in defeating the power it aims to surpass, that does not mean that the use of power was successful or justified in a general sense. Sure, Zant wins, for a while at least, but at what cost? He condemns the Twilight royal family for their failures to address their people's plight, but his solution is only to insert himself into that pre-existent power structure. He thinks that the only way to cease the power of oppressive systems is to counter it with power of his own. By failing to address that systems of power simply by their existence were what forced his people into their position and kept them there, Zant is left attempting to be a liberator while using the tools of oppression over those he claims to be liberating. Earlier, we talked about the story of Ganondorf's execution as one of the most important in the game. But there is one other story that is arguably even more important. In this scene, the light spirit Lanayru tells the story of the Interlopers, a group we later learn is the very same as the people of Twilight, such as Midna or Zant. In this story, deep in Hyrule's past, a group emerged who were well versed in magic. Using this knowledge, they attempted to seize the power of the Sacred Realm, the home of a great power left behind by the goddesses. In order to prevent this, the Light Spirits, acting upon the apparent will of the gods, sealed away both the magic of those people and the people themselves. This story ends with the quote that most succinctly sums up Twilight Princess's surface-level message. Those who do not know the danger of wielding power will, before long, be ruled by it. This story is very clearly a story from a narrator who believes the philosophy of the gods and himself to be true, so to really examine the philosophy from a more unbiased perspective, we'll have to look in several other places. But I like this story because it gives us the best insight into the system created by the philosophy of the gods that we get throughout the course of the game. It tells us, basically, the underlying idea about power held by those who arbitrate over it in Hyrule. Power is something which should be had, but not used to expand itself. This creates a very interesting desired system, one in which use of power to acquire more, even presented relatively amorally, such as in the story of the Interlopers, is in itself inherently evil, but possession of power in an unjust system is not. It is simultaneously a justification of unjust institutions and a condemnation of use of power to what many who support such institutions would consider to be its natural end. Fundamentally, it is a system which legitimizes the ruling class and denies the plight of the underclass. In a system where the power of the rulers is unquestionably legitimate, but others gaining power is evil, you have created a divinely regulated caste system. And so, we come to one of the most important questions in this video. What is the system of the gods of power of Hyrule? This is a question I sat with for some time while writing this video. In the early stages of scripting, I was planning on making the claim that a pivotal point of Twilight Princess's narrative was the suggestion that it was necessary to operate outside of the system in order to remedy a systemic evil. That is to say, direct action. But what I just said about the implications of the story of the Interlopers complicates the idea somewhat. Sure, there are instances of apparent operation outside of the system throughout the game, going beyond just the failings of Hyrule's institutions and systems of power. There are the earlier discussed implications that state power doesn't keep people safe but community aid networks do, as is shown by the fragility of the Hyrulean military but the mutual aid and strength provided by local level networks. There is, of course, the group in the game known as the Resistance, who operates independently of Hyrule, and then, of course, there is Link. But I would actually argue that, upon closer examination, these things may not be as simple as they seem. Link is a very interesting case within the game's plot, as we discussed much earlier in the video. While he comes from a background of, while not poverty, the people of Orden live relatively comfortably, nowhere near the levels of wealth and power held by those in Hyrule proper, Link is inextricably tied to the systems of power and justification of power prevalent there. Even though his story appears to be one of someone of humble origins rising to a higher power, Link is actually presented as someone who was never really part of the lower class to begin with, his chosen status implying that his affiliation with it was a temporary disposition before he could realize his true place and purpose. This allows Link to be presented as a working class character elevated by his worthiness, but in a way which is non-threatening to the legitimacy of Hyrule's structures of socio-economic and political power, because it is justified by the same systems and concepts which justify their possession of that power. The Resistance, the group in Hyrule taking proactive action against occupation and Ganondorf, is an equally interesting case. They were what originally led me to start framing the story as one of working outside of power structures. But the Resistance is a complicated thing to discuss. Sure, they appear to be operating outside of Hyrule's primary power structures, but does this really mean they're outside of the broad systems of power? Since we have seen that the Kingdom of Hyrule has failed as an institution to prevent evil, are all following actions thus outside of it? Well, maybe. The Resistance is literally called that, but the implications remain that, since Link is chosen and is not part of the institution of Hyrule, in a world where both the system and the elements apparently outside of it have a kind of divine right, does it matter if practically nothing doesn't? This is a difficult question to grapple with. The game presents a much more complicated political and theological system than one in which the gods back a monarch in their kingdom, providing a clear line between what is within and what is not. In Twilight Princess, you have a world in which not only is the kingdom and its monarch backed by divine power, but also those outside of it and even antithetical to it. When we discussed Ganondorf's execution, I left out one very important detail. Ganondorf, too, is chosen. As the sage says, by some divine prank, he, too, referencing Ganondorf, had been blessed with the chosen power of the gods. Ganondorf, the king of evil. The fact that he is also chosen means that we have to totally reconsider our ideas about Hylian theology, and remove any attributions of morality we might make an assumption. If it can be the will of the gods that both those who are just and those who are not have their power, then how can it be truly moral? Unlike in many real-world religions, there is no endgame for the will of the gods. It exists only for the sake of its own realization. Jumping off of this, then, perhaps our earlier choice of looking at the game from a perspective of whether the gods were correct or not was the wrong way of looking at it. In Hyrule, there appears to be little to no morality associated with the gods. The ultimate prerogative is that their law and systems are followed. They do not ever claim it to be just or right. Initially, I wanted to say that there existed a contradiction in Hyrule's systems of power, that it was strange that the game both has the idea of the ineffectiveness of the systems at play and the necessity to operate outside of them, but also implies that the system is divinely guaranteed. But now, looking back through this new lens, it's clear that a contradiction doesn't exist here if we think of the system of power as being the broad allocation of power by the gods, without moral affiliation or favoritism. While the implications exist that state power doesn't keep people safe or that Hyrule is a failed kingdom, they do not reflect on a failure of the gods, judged by their own systems at least, because within these allegedly failed institutions is an underlying adherence to their ideas about power. Those who have it keep it, and those without it do not seek more. At the end of the game, after the final blow has been dealt to Ganondorf, he makes one last bid for survival, to call upon his divinely granted power. But, as he does, without warning or explanation, the mark on his hand denoting his status disappears. He has lost the favor of the gods, by all appearances. But why? Why now? After an entire game of defying the will of the gods, of seeking to accumulate more power, why does he lose favor only here? I thought about this for a long time, and while this isn't a perfect solution, this is of course open to a significant amount of interpretation, I would say he lost it because, well, maybe the gods changed. That is to say, perhaps in this final moment, the gods did make a moral decision. They realized the only way to truly break the cycle was to remove that power entirely. Unlike their decision with the Twilight, they didn't give the power to Link or Zelda or anyone in Hyrule. It's simply gone, something no one can use. And so, again, while this explanation somewhat contradicts my earlier idea, that's kind of the point. Maybe, in the end, there was one true subversion of power structures. Or maybe not. So, we just talked about almost the very end of the game, but for this last bit, let's return to the very beginning. Russell delivers the first speaking line of the game, and while it's not especially memorable at first, it's an opening line that has a lot of retrospective significance. As Link and Russell are sitting at the edge of the Orden Spring, Russell says, "Tell me, do you ever feel a strange sadness as dusk falls? They say it's the only time when our world intersects with theirs. The only time we can feel the lingering regrets of spirits who have left our world." Here, it's pretty clear that even early on in the game, what's being described is a link between the world of light and the world of twilight. But what I would say is even more interesting is the sense of melancholy Russell describes, what he characterizes as lingering regrets. As we learn in Lanayru's story of the interlopers and through Xanth's several monologues, for their acquisition of power, the people of Twilight were permanently banished to a parallel world. But despite the fact that I have made some moral judgments about it, throughout much of the game, this is presented at worst as morally gray, with any condemnation of it muddied by being associated with characters who have explicitly corrupted motivations. As a result, the few times the game actually expresses thoughts on this event are especially interesting, and Russell's association of sadness with it is no exception. This connection would almost seem to suggest that even without an actual knowledge of the event, there exists some kind of general recognition that the event was, well, sad, and not simply the sealing of a purely evil group, as is basically presented in Lanayru's telling of the story. Later, while not necessarily condemning what occurred in itself, Zelda has a very interesting quotation when discussing the Twilight occupation. In response to Midna claiming that Zelda shouldn't help her, she says, "These dark times are the result of our deeds, yet it is you who have reaped the penalty." Zelda here is suggesting something somewhat radical. Now, while she is not explicitly saying that Hyrule almost deserves what has happened, or that the Twilight retaliation was justified, she is very close to saying that, by extension of her suggesting that Midna should not be the one suffering the consequences of the actions of Hyrule. And I would like to note the distinction between Hyrule and the Light World. While it's easy to conflate the two, it's important to remember that the Twilight are also originally people of the Light World. The Twilight Realm is their prison, not their place of origin. They were removed from their home in the Light World and were put there forcefully. The game is explicit about this. Which brings us to one of the most conflicted events in the game, which is also the very last. After the fate of Ganondorf, after the credits to the game have rolled, we are presented with one last scene. In it, we witness the final farewell between Midna, Link, and Zelda as Midna makes the decision to return to the Realm of Light. Standing before the mirror, Midna says, "Well, I guess this is farewell, huh? Light and shadow can't mix, as we all know. But never forget there's another world bound to this one." To which Zelda responds, "Shadow and light are two sides of the same coin. One cannot exist without the other. I now know the reason that the goddesses left the Mirror of Twilight in this world. They left it because it was their design that we should meet." Immediately after, as Midna activates the mirror to return to her kingdom, she makes one final decision: to shatter the mirror, at once proving her worthiness and choosing for her people permanent isolation. This series of events, to me, is one of the most difficult to consider in the game. For one, when discussing the relationship between Midna's people and hers, Zelda invokes darkness, something only ever implicated within the game in reference to Ganondorf and those directly influenced by him. This implication, in a statement which inherently does not acknowledge the nuance of the plight of the Twilight, that they are of the light forced into darkness, presents a very confusing message. This, of course, being on top of Midna's statement that light and shadow can't mix, stated almost as common knowledge, based again on questionable logic. So, what is the message supposed to be here? Well, while I've made claims about the game's messages a lot in this episode and presented them just as I see them without giving much personal opinion, I feel like I have to say that this message is, at very least, problematic. The implication that forced segregation is self-fulfilling in its creation of a circumstance where two sides are inherently incompatible is worrying. Again, the Twilight are of the light. It is their home. They need it to survive. They need artifacts in their realm to provide light because there is not enough for them to survive, and they are not hurt by being in the light world. But I think we can take more away from this than simply saying that Midna and Zelda are wrong. Rather, we should consider how their wrongness allows us to think about the rest of the story in a new way. To me, this presents a melancholy end, not only to the surface level story, in the way that Midna's departure is sad, but to the narrative of power laid out in the game. Throughout the course of the game, we see story after story about power. At the beginning of this, I said that was what Twilight Princess was fundamentally about, and I stand by that. We see the failures of structures of power, institutions of injustice, systems of oppression time and time again. But as this and our section on what the system even is would seem to suggest, is that these things are inherently inescapable and that their only purpose is to be fulfilled. That we can feel like we've escaped the system, the influence of power, but we haven't and can't. The reason the end is so sad to me is that it represents a complete resignation to these systems just by nature of their existence. There is neither justification of them, nor an attribution of morality or justness to them. They simply are. Their power is self-justifying. And that's a very scary thought.